thank you so much for joining us here today for this really important conversation. As I'm sure folks are aware, this has been an incredibly difficult legislative session for the LGBTQ plus community, but particularly for the transgender community and even more particularly for transgender children. This is a very concerted effort by opponents of LGBTQ equality from major national groups who have been working with legislators across the country to introduce legislation that discriminates against LGBTQ plus people, but as I said, particularly transgender children. This year, the Human Rights Campaign is opposing more than 320 bills from across the country. And unfortunately, 2022 is the third legislative session in which the attacks on transgender youth have continued to escalate. In 2020, we had 79 bills that specifically targeted the transgender community. Of course, nearly all anti-LGBTQ bills in some ways will impact the transgender community, but this is 79 bills that are specifically targeting the transgender community that were filed in 2020. At that time, that was a record. That was more bills than we had even had filed in 2016, the year of HB2's bathroom bill that were targeting trans folks. 2021, that number more than doubled, or just about doubled to 150 bills across the country. And this year, we are already tracking more than 130 bills, and it's not even April. I'm pretty sure it's not even April. So this is an incredibly egregious and scary time, incredibly egregious attack at a very scary time, not only for advocates for the LGBTQ community, but for LGBTQ people, and again, particularly transgender kids and their parents. We have seen attacks on transgender youth from basically every direction. We have seen our opponents try to take away transgender youth support from their doctors, from their parents, from their teachers, from their coaches, from their teammates, from books, from curriculum entirely. And each of these pieces takes another piece of that support away. And that has a really incredible impact on transgender youth and the people who love them. Whether you're talking about Texas, where it's actually, the governor has declared it to be child abuse to get age-appropriate, medically necessary, gender-affirming care for transgender youth. The governor has deemed that child abuse and has begun a witch hunt to look for families who in fact have affirmed their children and have those children removed from their homes. Whether it's the Don't Say Gay and Trans bill in Florida, which is trying to make it so that LGBTQ youth aren't able to tell the truth about who they are at school. They're not able to hear that other people like them exist, and that that for kids who have same-sex parents, that they're not allowed to share that. The attacks that we are seeing range from attacks on medical care. They range to talking about letting transgender youth play school sports consistent with their gender identity, school, where sports are supposed to be about education. And all of these different pieces come together to create an environment of terror and fear. We have been very successful, we, the movement, have been very successful in defeating these bills across the last several years, with only about 10% of these discriminatory bills passing last year. And in previous years, it had been closer to 5%. But every one of those bills that does pass imposes incredible harm. And even just having bills introduced imposes incredible harm as people become afraid, as the rhetoric around LGBTQ people starts to seep in. And so I'm really excited to have these very exciting guests with us today to share the leadership that they have been providing in their states in fighting back against these discriminatory bills. We have a really exciting cross-section of the country here to share with you the work that they've been doing on all of these different kinds of bills. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing everything that they have to say. Thanks, Ben.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kate. We're going to turn first to Alabama Representative Neil Rafferty. Just for context, Alabama is one vote away from sending SB 184. Oh, I think there's an echo there. Alabama is one vote away from sending 184 to the governor's desk. This is a bill that would make it a felony to provide age-appropriate, medically necessary gender-affirming care to transgender youth, and is similar to a bill that was unsuccessful last year. Alabama has also been seriously considering a bathroom bill in the style of North Carolina's reviled HB 2. Representative Rafferty has been a leader in fighting back against these bills. So, Representative? You want to try speaking now? Unmuting. There's a weird feedback loop. Why don't we, if it's fine with you, maybe what we can do is come back to you in a second. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's turn to Florida Senator Chevron Jones. For context, last year, Florida passed a bill preventing transgender students from participating in school sports programs consistent with their gender identity, which Governor DeSantis championed. This year, Florida has been in the national spotlight for two sets of bills, which currently are on the governor's desk. One is known as the Stop Woke Act, and the other is known as the Don't Say Gay or Trans bill. The brazen discrimination of both these bills has captured national attention, and Senator Jones has been on the front lines and pushing back. Senator Jones.
Thank you so much, Ben, and good afternoon to all of you. I have the great honor of representing portions of both Miami-Dade and southern portions of Broward County in Florida. And in 2020, I was elected to the state Senate as the first LGBTQ person to be elected to the state Senate. It's a travesty that in this past legislative session, Governor DeSantis and his GOP allies have once again generated headlines for Florida for all of the wrong reasons. When we should be dealing with the insurance hikes in Florida, when we should be dealing with the rent crisis that we're dealing with in Florida. We didn't deal with any of those things. We dealt with Ron DeSantis's culture war that he continues to go across the country and the state of Florida, saying that we are the free state of Florida. It's a travesty that we are still dealing with this. The Don't Say Gay bill, as it has came to be known as colloquially, was one of many attacks on our most vulnerable communities in DeSantis's cultural war agenda as he ramps up his 2024 primary bid for president. Beyond my perspective as a gay man and a state lawmaker, I'm also a former public educator, one who's been in the classroom with children, one who've been able to listen to students as they came to share some of their most pressing issues that they could not even share with their parents. As an elected official, as elected officials, period, we all have a responsibility to improve people's lives, their daily lives, to move the ball forward when it comes to safer schools and safer communities. And I think that's why we all are here. That's why HRC has brought us all together to bring to light what legislatures all across the country are doing, and they are on their own agenda and not on the people's agenda. And this is blatantly hostile legislations that's doing the total opposite than what we should be doing in bringing everyone together. Every Florida student, including our LGBTQ plus kids, deserves to learn in safe, inclusive environments where they are treated with dignity and respect, not be further isolated, stigmatized, or dehumanized because of who they are. Conversations about gender identity and orientation are not taboo topics by the Florida legislature. So this bill was rich coming from the party that conveniently wraps itself in small government rhetoric that they continuously talk about every chance that they get. But this is another stain on Florida's history, and history will hold every last one of us accountable, even to the ones who are fighting right now. We will be held accountable in what we say and what we don't say. And I believe that's why we are here today. Classrooms should be places of inclusion where every Florida child can learn safely and ask questions, but not in Ron DeSantis's Florida. Already countless teachers across the state have already said that they will leave the profession amidst a teacher shortage altogether due to this and due to the other culture wars that has been going across the state of Florida. In the final days of session that just wrapped up early last week, many on the other side, they said the quiet parts out loud. The opponents have called this bill the groomers. They called us groomers because we supported the bill. That schools are socially engineering children. The Florida Family Policy Council president called this "Don't Turn My Son Into a Daughter" bill. Or that children are confused. In conversations behind the scenes, some of my colleagues have made it extremely clear what they are trying to do. They want to silence our voices, but I'm here to let it be known. You can't silence our voices. You will not silence our voices. And that's why we are here today. We're going to push back now, and we're going to continue to push back until we let it be known that we have a right to be here and we have a right to raise our families in the same communities that they are allowed to raise their families in. Thank you once again for having me, and thank you for pulling all of us together to push back on these hateful legislation that's making its way across the country.
Thank you so much for that, Senator. Appreciate it. Next, we're going to turn to Kentucky Senator Karen Berg. For context, Kentucky has about a dozen anti-LGBTQ bills filed this legislative session, ranging from religious refusal bills to bans on age-appropriate, best practice gender-affirming care for transgender youth, to bills that would prevent transgender students from participating in school sports programs. Senator Berg has spoken eloquently about the harms done by anti-LGBTQ legislation and how these bills impact the well-being of transgender youth. Senator?
Thank you, and I really appreciate you all having me here this morning. This is something I care deeply about. I am a state senator here in Kentucky. Historically here in this state, our Kentucky High School Athletic Association was completely in charge of making determinations as to eligibility and who was allowed and who wasn't allowed to play on a team. And somehow, even though in this state, we have never once had a complaint, either with the High School Athletic Association or through any other school venue, we have never had a complaint about who's been playing on what team. Our legislature decided to bring forth a bill that basically in the House version would have eliminated basically all children from participating in school sports from kindergarten on. On the Senate side, it started in I believe first grade. I was able to at least put an amendment to let first through fifth graders play. But these bills, guys, are being brought in from national organizations, given to state legislators, and they are being asked to pass these simply because they think these are polling well. No consideration to the harm that this is doing to children. So here in this state, the sponsor of the bill on the Senate side, I was like, why is this guy sponsoring this bill? It's because they feel that he's in a tough primary and they want to give him something to help him. My Republican colleagues are actually using this as a political ploy to get votes, no matter who it hurts. And as the parent of a trans child trying to navigate the world of middle school and high school, it takes a village. It takes a village to raise a child. And what they are intentionally doing is destroying that village so that we don't have it in an effort to hurt children for their own political gain. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Next, we're going to turn to Kansas Representative Stephanie Byers. For context, Kansas has a terrific track record of beating back anti-LGBTQ legislation, but it's extremely hard work. Last year, the governor vetoed a bill that would have prevented transgender students from playing school sports, but the bill is back again, not once, but twice. Representative Byers has been an important force in resisting these bills and brings both her personal story and her professional expertise to the fight. Representative?
Thank you, Ben. In Kansas, it's been interesting to say the least. Serving as the first transgender representative in the state of Kansas and the first Native American who is transgender in any state legislature anywhere in the United States, there's so much that falls on your shoulders when you go to the well to speak against these things. Because although I represent the District 86 here in the Kansas House of Representatives, my constituents lay all across the state. I get emails and calls and cards from folks everywhere across Kansas who write to me and say, I know that you hear me. My own legislator doesn't hear me. My own senator doesn't hear me, but you hear me. They don't want to listen to the fact that they're hurting trans kids. And when you look at these bills that are coming through, kindergarten through 12th grade and on in through college, they're trying to ban just trans girls here in Kansas, not trans guys, but just trans girls. And when you look at this and you take it from the place of an imbalance of power, the state legislature versus the one trans girl who has signed up with our secondary association to be involved in athletics, one versus the state legislature. There's such an imbalance of power there. And we see this as an aggressive attack against the trans community over and over again. It's repeated action. Well, when you have an imbalance of power, an aggressive act, and repeated action, that's textbook bullying, no matter how you look at it. And for what reason? To get votes from people that don't really, they've got plenty of things. This is Kansas. There's a super majority here. They do not need to garner these votes on the backs of trans kids and picking on trans kids who don't have a voice. And when I come in as a trans woman and stand at the well and speak, the 125 members of the Kansas House of Legislators gets completely quiet. They stop moving, they sit down because they know when they bring this in, they are stepping on human rights. They understand that, and yet they do it anyway. And then the next day, they have the audacity to come to me and apologize, to ask for forgiveness and work to try to convince me that they are really nice, good people, yet they're going to vote like this to pick on trans kids. And we just see this happening over and over again, and not just in Kansas. We're seeing this everywhere. When you look around my surrounding states, the same bill introduced in Missouri. We see Oklahoma just passed it. We saw it signed into law in Iowa. I mean, where does this end? And where do trans families go for safety, for sanctity? And we're talking about just affirming in sports. And then the details they bring in, they lie. They don't add all of it to it. They'll talk about the Connecticut lawsuit like it's ongoing, yet we know that it ended. And we also know that the cisgender girl that brought the lawsuit in Connecticut, she beat both the trans girls in foot races twice in the next 8 days after she filed the lawsuit. They'll bring up statistics, but don't give the full value of everything they do. They're stopping the sports. And the representative from Idaho that started all this mess, she comes in and testifies about things that took place 3 years ago as if they're happening now, because she doesn't even know. When we saw in our Senate Education Committee this year, 116 opponents to this, and there were only a handful of proponents. And of that handful of proponents, most of them were paid attorneys that were associated with the 3 organizations that have been driving this legislation across the United States. This is something that we need to make sure is highlighted, that people understand. These trans kids, they've got voices now. They've got us. They've got the folks that are here on this call. They've got myself. They've got the other 3 members of the LGBT caucus that we have in Kansas, and we speak out, and we will continue to speak out. There are families all across the nation that are speaking out, and we need to amplify those voices to make sure that people understand that we are citizens, we are Americans, and we have all the rights that everyone else has as well.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to turn to Tennessee Senator Ramesh Akbari. For context, Tennessee is one of the hardest states nationwide on anti-LGBTQ legislation. In the last 3 years, Tennessee's had more than 60 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced, and last year passed 2 bathroom bills, the first and only bathroom bills to have passed since North Carolina's HB2. Tennessee has major fights looming in the next few weeks, and Senator Akbari is a tremendous leader and ally in this fight. Senator?
Thank you, Ben, and certainly thank you to the Human Rights Campaign for pulling this together. It is exactly what you all have said. It is a slate of hate that is designed to attack states across this country. And the people who lose are our children, our trans kids, our LGBTQ families, and at what cost? In Tennessee, like you said, we passed the, or I should say they, because I didn't vote for those bills, passed the first bathroom bill since North Carolina. And they also passed a ban on trans kids being able to play sports in K-12. Now this year, they came back and said, look, we're going to see what more damaging things we can do. There's a bill currently being considered that will take away funding from schools that do not enforce the gender on a child's birth certificate when they decide to play sports. The one that I think is even more damaging and incredibly hurtful is a pronoun bill, where a teacher will not have to recognize a student's preferred pronouns, a teacher or administrator, and if they refuse to do that, they cannot be removed from their job, they cannot be sued. That to me is saying that you as a child who has certain pronouns is not worthy of the dignity and respect that you deserve. And it is devastating. I think that I saw legislation in Utah, and I saw that the governor vetoed, and I thought, wow, now that is a hero who recognizes that suicide rates are even more pronounced. One, it's the second cause of death in teenagers, but even more pronounced in our trans kids. Why would you put them in a position where they would feel less than when they already have a difficult battle ahead? We also have legislation that will specifically ban trans men from participating in college sports. I said it earlier, it's a slate of hate that does not move Tennessee forward. The business community is against it. It makes Tennessee a state that is not welcoming. If you're an LGBTQ family, why would you want to locate in a state where representatives and senators are constantly attacking your values and your very being, are putting your safety and your dignity in danger? So I stand firmly and proudly as an ally. I will do everything that I can and then some to fight for our LGBTQ community and specifically our trans kids. Because at the end of the day, all children are children, and they deserve to grow up in an environment that is safe, that is healthy, that is affirming, so that they can become the adults that we need in our society. Frederick Douglass said that it is easier to make sure we don't have broken children than to try and heal broken men. And I think that our legislatures need to take that to heart. And I'm a proud Christian, and I think those who are Christians who use religion to propose hate really need to look inside themselves and wonder, is this really what Jesus would do? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. Appreciate that. Next, we're going to turn to Texas Representative Jessica Gonzalez. For context, the Texas legislature is not in session this year, but that hasn't kept Governor Abbott or AG Paxton from continuing their assault on transgender youth in the form of lawless executive action to consider best practice, age-appropriate, gender-affirming care for transgender youth as child abuse. Last year, Texas had more anti-LGBTQ bills introduced than any other in the country, 60 bills, and unfortunately a ban on transgender youth participating in school sports consistent with their gender identity was passed. Representative Gonzalez is the leader of the LGBT caucus in the state legislature and has been a forceful advocate in pushing back on the unrelenting attacks on the LGBTQ community in Texas. Representative? I believe she is joining via phone. Is it possible to unmute her phone, Henry?
I can't do it on my end, but here.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me today. So last session, we witnessed the largest assault by Texas Republicans against the LGBTQ community, specifically focused on our most vulnerable, our transgender children. I worked alongside the LGBTQ caucus, our fearless parents of our transgender kids, and our ally advocacy organizations to defeat over 75 anti-LGBTQ bills that were filed through 4 legislative sessions. The only one that Republicans were able to pass, unfortunately, was a discriminatory transgender sports ban. But that was also after many attempts and Republicans having to create a whole new committee that was stacked, of course, with Republicans to advance this legislation. And then, to make matters worse, as soon as multiple sessions were over, and Republican primaries began, these Republican elected officials renewed their efforts to push this anti-LGBTQ messaging targeting our transgender kids. They started removing access to mental health care resources for LGBTQ youth from governmental websites, removing books from our classrooms that discuss sexual orientation or gender identity, calling for the repeal of same-sex marriage, and shutting down hospital programs that give our trans youth access to health care. And now our twice indicted Attorney General wrote a fake legal opinion that classified life-saving gender-affirming care as child abuse. And the governor then wrote a fake executive order directing the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate these families that have transgender children. And they just simply, they've just gone too far this time. They are targeting innocent, happy children that are in loving homes, and literally they are sending CPS investigators to their homes to ask questions. And they're scared. Our families are scared. Our kids are scared. They want to take these children away from their parents, and then accuse their parents of child abuse just for simply accepting their child, loving their child, and giving them this life-saving medical care, and put them in this broken foster care system that our state has already declared. The courts have declared that our foster care system is unconstitutional in the way that it is. And so they want to put our transgender children in there and take them out of their homes. And we know that it's all just simply to pander to a small portion of the electorate, when the majority of Texans don't support this behavior. They're lawless. They're being bullies. And so our state, it has real issues to worry about. And Republicans just want to focus on being hateful and discriminatory. And Texans are starting to see that. I think on both sides, right? And this year, our AG, our governor, and a slew of anti-equality statewide officials and legislators are up for re-election. And every session, they renew their efforts to attack our community. And we simply just can't afford another session like this with Republicans in charge. And so everyone in Texas, and clearly in other states, as we've heard, we need to pay attention. Everybody needs to pay attention to what is happening, and make plans to vote in November so we can restore our common sense leadership back into our states. And we must show that these anti-LGBTQ politicians, that there will be consequences to their actions, and that our community and our allies are not going to stand for their baseless attacks, and that our children are not pawns for their primary re-election campaigns, and that love will win and hate will lose. And so, as long as I'm in the Texas House, I vowed to fight to make sure that every child and every LGBTQ person is treated equal, and we must continue fighting for that at our state level, and as well as our at the national level. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative. And we're going to circle back to our final speaker, Alabama Representative Neil Rafferty. Again, just for context, Alabama is one vote away from sending SB 184 to the governor's desk. This is a bill that would make it a felony to provide age-appropriate, medically necessary, gender-affirming care to transgender youth, and is similar to a bill that was unsuccessful last year. Alabama has also been seriously considering a bathroom bill in the style of North Carolina's HB 2. Representative Rafferty has been a leader in fighting back against these bills. Representative.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, thank you, HRC, for pulling us all together, and thanks everyone for joining today. I would say that first and foremost, I'm just going to echo the sentiments of my other colleagues from across the country here, that this is part of a larger national strategy to create a new culture war. The problem is that they're obviously attacking families, they're attacking children, they're using children as political footballs for cheap political points. We want to talk about Alabama's bathroom bill. The sponsor of that bill was brought up the issue of sexual assault occurring in bathrooms. I called him out on this when he brought this subject up by that there's not a single transgender individual that's been put in, that has been indicted or indicated to be a perpetrator of any of those crimes. B, we're not doing anything to actually address the issue of sexual assault. We're not talking about consent. We're not talking about bodily autonomy. We're not talking about any of those issues that would be to be preventative measures for sexual assaults that that the sponsor of the bill was putting forward. Instead, he was using transgender children as political pawns, as political footballs in order to gain cheap political points. Once again, it is primary season here in Alabama too. So, you know, it all kind of bleeds in together there. We want to talk about this gender affirming care ban bill. This bill has been introduced and reintroduced for the past 3 years. It's like a bad zombie movie. It just keeps coming back up. It's, you know, only supported by a very narrow margin that is on the very fringes of the right. You know, I've talked to many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle who do not like this bill because A, it is not conservative. B, it is taking 140 people, that is 105 people in the Alabama House and 35 people in the Alabama Senate, and putting us in the doctor's office and then wagging our finger at the parents saying, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know, you don't love your children. Why would you want to do this? You don't know what's best. You know, but we're talking about taking an unprecedented move of taking 140 people into the doctor's office and dictating what parents do with the private family medical decisions with their children and the decisions that they make with a team of healthcare providers. So it is despicable. It's terrible. And we got to just make sure that we're standing up, that we're amplifying these voices, and that we're amplifying the dissent and the doubt, and just putting the doubt in the air that this is not the right thing to do, that this is detrimental to not just the families, but also to these children and to the communities and to any sort of progress for inclusion and moving our state forward. I just know Alabama's better than this, and I know Alabama's deserves better than this. And I would say, you know, we will continue to fight to make Alabama safe for all who call her home.
Thank you so much, Representative Rafferty. We're going to go ahead and open it up for Q&A now if media have questions. Henry, can you just remind folks how to ask a question here? Should we just put it in the chat?
Yep, put your name in the chat and your outlet if you would like to ask a question, and then we will we'll call on you, and please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Awesome. So we'll just give it a second or so for folks to populate questions. And Serena Marshall with Now This. Serena, go ahead.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for this really informative call. I was just wondering if, Kate, you could clarify those 320 bills across the country. Is that an accumulative number from 2020, 2021, and so far in 2022? I know oftentimes these bills get reintroduced every session. So just individual bills. I was just wondering on what that number would be. And then I know a lot of you talked about how you're working to counter some of these bills, but do you have specific campaigns that are happening around the country to address that? Or is it just on a state-by-state campaign basis?
Well, I can answer my part first. The numbers that I gave you are the number of bills that are active this year. So 2022 is the second year of several legislative sessions. And so there are bills that have rolled over from 2021 into 2022. And so the 2022 numbers do in some cases include that. Sorry, excuse me. But those are all bills that are active, that actually have a possibility of moving, and in some cases they do. Looking at poor Tennessee, where that second year, man, we had a bill pass the first day of the second year of the legislative session, because that means in most states, if you have a bill roll over, it picks up wherever it left off. And so that particular bill, which was a license to discriminate in child welfare services bill, which I believe was 2020 that bill passed. It literally passed on the very first day of leg session. So those numbers that I gave you are not cumulative. They are for each year.
Great. And then does anyone want to speak to the question around any efforts, any sort of organized campaign efforts in terms of pushing these bills back?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead and jump in. I think that, we do kind of see an organization that we talk about. I know that for myself, that I studied intently what happened in the Texas special session, knowing that what was going to come to Kansas was going to be the same thing we saw last year, but to gain ideas on how we can address what happens. Between myself and the other transgender legislators across the country, we're in constant communication with each other. We talk and get feedback from each other as well as to what we do and how we address these things. As far as there being an overarching national organization, we're trying to get those coalitions built so that we can make sure that we do have resources to bring about, no matter what state these pop up in, that we have folks that are willing to come in and speak and be able to do what we can to stop this hateful legislation from moving forward.
Great.
And I'll just say there are, in most states, there are state groups that are fighting back against this legislation, including, I believe, every single one of the states that joined us on the call today. There are state groups who are doing this work, LGBTQ plus equality groups who are doing this work, who are in state legislatures, who have lobbyists or are lobbyists and are working on trying to defeat the bad bills and pass the good bills. And of course, at HRC, we work in very close partnership with those state groups to do what we can to be supporting their efforts. And there are other national groups who do that as well. So we are all working really hard to oppose these bills. And to the extent that there's a coordinated campaign, you're looking at it, it's this group of folks, it's the folks who are fighting this in the states. And as I said, there are other national groups who are working on it as well.
Just to point of clarity, if I may, so there is not then a federal campaign to address this on a nationwide level. It's more targeting each state's individual law.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Equality Act at the federal level, which would certainly help with some elements of what we're seeing in state legislatures. The Equality Act would not solve all of the problems that we are seeing at state legislatures just from a federalism perspective. Some of these are things that states have the ability to be legislating on and that the federal government doesn't have the ability to take that away. That said, when you're fighting state legislation, you have to do it state by state, and it's hand-to-hand combat in each of these states. And the folks that you have seen in front of you today are some of the leaders on this in their states. But let me tell you, we've had this bad legislation introduced in, I think it's 36 states this year, and people are fighting in every single state.
Thank you so much for that. The next question is from Sharon Lurie at US News and World Report. Sharon put in the chat, what are the main organizations promoting anti-LGBTQ bills?
So the two biggest and most involved organizations at the national level are the Alliance Defending Freedom and the Heritage Foundation. They actually have a website that you can go to get, if you're a legislator, to ask for legislation that would do the things that we've been talking about here. They've been very, this is not like a clandestine effort. They've been very open about the fact that they are helping push these bills across the country. I will also say, and some of the legislators may want to speak to what this looks like in their specific states. That's not necessarily what the groups are called on the ground. They have other groups that they work in partnership with on the ground who may be the people who are directly handing these bills over to legislators. There may be a middle group, but those are the folks who are really behind these. And that's why the bills look so similar across the country. I would say that the sports bans are about 98% the same from state to state. The medical care bills have a little bit more variation, but I would still say we're talking like 92, 93%. I'm making these numbers up, but just to give you a sense of where we are. and the bathroom bills are almost, carbon copies of each other. So they're definitely coming from the same places, and the folks there also are willing to travel around the country. And I think Representative Byers alluded to the representative from Idaho, who was one of the first folks who worked on these bills, and how she's been traveling around the country, I believe on behalf of Alliance Defending Freedom, to help other legislators pass such bills.
Any of the legislative leaders interested in touching on this as well?
Here in Kansas, Kansas Family Voice has been one of the proponents that brought this stuff in. Of course, the Kansas Family Voice is formerly the Kansas Family Policy Alliance, which is an arm of Alliance Defending Freedom. So we're seeing that combined effort when they bring these things in together. And like was said, yeah, it's the same legislation. And even when we look at the 11 proponents this time around, most of them either were on payrolls from ADF or received significant financial contributions from ADF, including the Women's Liberation Front, which works on a grant from ADF, to come against these things. So it's hard when you look at the fact that these proponents are lawyers coming in to talk, and we've got families and trans kids coming in to defend against it.
Representative Rafferty, did you want to chime in on that as well?
Sure. I was just going to add that, one of the groups here in Alabama that's really been a big proponent in pushing, particularly the gender affirming care ban bill, has been Eagle Forum. That's been one of the bigger pushes right there, which, they consider themselves a conservative, religious liberty, but for some reason, this is an issue that they've kind of manufactured a crisis. They've done all these shock and awe tactics with it to try to push and draw more public attention to the bill, even though it's based off of lies and half-truths and just a misunderstanding of transgender people, the transgender experience and their families. But the Eagle Forum's been a huge one down here. Just as, in every other state, you have to fight it your own way. We've been able to develop a broad coalition down here of folks that are against it for various different reasons, whether it's from the schools to the medical establishment to the business community. There's certain areas of people that all hate the bill for one reason or another. So just as you fight it in a different way, it's also being pushed in a different way from state to state as well. That's why you have to have that state to state strategy.
Great. Thank you all for that. The next question comes from Trudy Ring at The Advocate. Trudy, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for hosting this.
Yeah.
I have kind of a two-part question. At a time when there's been unprecedented progress for the LGBTQ community, and we have a friendly administration in the White House, is this spate of state legislation, is that backlash to progress, or what are the factors causing it? And secondly, specifically on the Don't Say Gay or Trans bills, how do they differ from the so-called no promo homo bills we saw some years ago?
Well, I'll start with the second question, and then I have thoughts to offer on the first question, but I suspect others do as well, so I'll make some space for them. The second question about, they're very similar. I mean, basically the idea between the Don't Say Gay and the no promo homo, or it's basically the same idea. What I would just add, just to make sure that this is clear for everyone, is that this bill in Florida has been in some ways sort of coined Don't Say Gay. It's also very much about trans youth. It also is Don't Say Trans. And so I do want to lift that up to make it clear, this is about trying to erase the entirety of the LGBTQ community, and from curriculum, from history books, from just basic identities being able to be expressed in the classroom. And I do think that there's this sense of, a sense that if LGBTQ youth don't know the words for their identities, if they've never seen a role model who is LGBTQ, that will then keep them from becoming LGBTQ, which is, of course, not correct. What seeing thriving LGBTQ adults means, what knowing that LGBTQ folks are out there, what that means, that does allow for kids to then have the terminology to be able to label how they're feeling and to be able to communicate about that. It doesn't impact who they are at any level, and that's just silliness. So that's the second question. And then for the first question, do others want to jump in on that first? That was on the question of progress. I'll just say, and perhaps others will want to jump in as they're reminded of the question, but the question was, is there backlash? Is this about backlash? And that is absolutely part of it. I think our opponents, when we're talking about EDF, when we're talking about the Heritage Foundation, and to be clear, these are not people who are proponents of women's sports. These are not people who care deeply about the efficacy of puberty blockers. These are not people who even truly care about bathrooms. These are people whose mission is to roll back acceptance of LGBTQ people. And they did that when they were advocating for criminalization of same-sex sexual relationships. They were doing that when they were advocating against marriage equality. They were doing that when they were putting the bathroom bills forward. That's what they're doing now. So it's not that they care deeply about women's sports. They have cared about women's sports for exactly as long as their polling information has told them that they can make women's sports about hurting trans people. And the same is true of the gender affirming care. Do they care about the efficacy of puberty blockers? They do not. They've cared about that for exactly as long as it's given them the ability to try to make people afraid of what it means for children to be receiving gender affirming care. And so these folks are desperate to score a win. They are losing. And the more that we have progress, the more desperate they will become. And I think, frankly, we heard from, I think, every single one of the legislators brought up the idea that this is about being cruel to children. This is their best work at this point, is trying to make people afraid of kids. And so that's how desperate they are. That's how far we've come. And, we obviously have to continue to lean in and help clear up any questions that folks have in order to prevent them from being able to do this fear mongering. And this is the best that they have right now.
That's great. Thank you for that. The next question is from Rebecca Chung. Yeah.
If I can interrupt you for a second, I think Representative Byers had something she wanted to add.
Yes. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go for it.
That's fine. And just banking off of this, when you step back and you look at how these came about, after Obergefell, that's when we start seeing the attacks on the trans community. After we see the Supreme Court say, yes, same-sex marriage is the law of the land, then it turns the same legislation to it. And I'm 59 years old, right? Born in '63. My life kind of reflects the civil rights movements that we've had across the United States in this time. What we see going on, it's hard not to look at this and assume that it's just an attempt to push people back in the closet. I mean, we've gone from a place as a nation where we were unaccepting to a place where we would tolerate. And now we're moving into full acceptance for every person, not just same-sex couples, not just same-sex relationships, but for the trans community, the non-binary communities as well. We're seeing that. And so this backlash comes back. It's almost like they think we can push people back in the closet and make it where it's uncomfortable to be out. We won't see this anymore. And they can return us back to where we were. It's based on fear. It's fear that their belief system is a part of the past. So they're, because we're seeing the future around us. The acceptance of people is the future. We know it's going to keep moving that way. But that fear comes out and they begin to try to do whatever they can to push people back in the closet and pretend that we don't exist anymore.
And Ben, I'll just add to that. It's a gross miscalculation. Our young people are brilliant and they're informed and they are not going to tolerate this foolishness. So they really are those who, push this hate and this nonsense. They're really just the last gasps of breath for them. Because young people are, whether it's rights for all, or we're talking about our climate or anything else, this is the last end of the road for these people.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Rebecca Chung, Nextstar's Kansas Capitol Bureau. Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, my question is for Representative Byers. Representative Byers, if this bill, the transgender athlete ban bill, if it passes into law this year, could you elaborate on maybe some specific steps that could be taken as far as potential legal action? What could that look like? And then my second question, there are also, lawmakers in the Senate that have been pretty adamant about pushing this issue forward, expressing what they believe to be serious concerns. Do you think their sentiments are also fabricated to further feed into what's been mentioned as a political ploy?
I would say, to answer the second question, absolutely. I mean, we can get down to the level of the fact that the person that brought this bill both last year and this year in Kansas, I went to college with her back in the 80s in Oklahoma. I worked with her at Wichita North High School together. She became an administrator for middle schools and Wichita schools the same time that I came out and began living authentically. And her responses in middle school principal meetings about the possibility of myself walking into her school to recruit kids were such negative things that we see this as an ongoing issue. This is not new in any way, shape, or form. And she is one of the few proponents that really pushes this. Word comes back to us over and over again that people in the Republican Party in the State House of Kansas would really, really not want to see this happen. They understand what it does. So yeah, we do see that. As far as the legal ramifications, if it becomes law, if you're paying attention to what's happened, the Kansas Senate, when they passed it out with a veto-proof majority. And so, I mean, it hasn't come up on the House side yet, so we'll see what happens. But we've already had the ACLU of Kansas engaged with this. We've got, you can hear the ding ding of the dry cleaning doors opening and closing as attorneys are taking their suits in to get cleaned. They're ready for this. They know this is going to come down. And if it does, there's a legal fight here. We start looking at the equity issues of it. Why is it only target, trans girls and not trans boys? We can use the Neil Gorsuch application of Bostic, the but for. Would this be existing but for the fact that these people are transgender? So we can definitely see how these court cases come up about and how it can very easily be proven to be unconstitutional. It would be great for everybody for the lawsuit in Idaho to move forward and come to a resolution. And we're pretty sure that the end result with it is going to be that Idaho's laws will be determined to be unconstitutional, but we've got to get it moved there.
Great, thank you so much. The next question comes from Michael Jones at Super Creator, and I just want to remind folks, if you want to ask a question, just please put your name and media outlet in the chat. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you guys for doing this, and thank you for taking my question. I'd just like any of you to speak to the specific impact on LGBTQ students and youth who don't have the family safety net and rely on school and sports to experience a sense of belonging. There's obviously, rightfully so, a lot of focus on the impact that this has on families, but I also am curious to know if any of the state lawmakers or anyone at HRC can speak to the impact that this specifically has on students and youth who don't have the family safety net that so many of us rely on.
Who'd like to, it seems like everyone would like to answer, which is great. Who'd like to take a chance at that first?
Well, I can jump in. I think that's what makes these bills so dangerous, right? Because they are attacking communities that have been historically marginalized, and where instead of building up, we're actually tearing down. So I'm happy that we have groups like the ACLU, like HRC, that are actively engaged, that sue the mess out of legislatures and for these bills, which is why I always say, thank goodness for the three branches of government, because if the executive and the legislative are doing their thing, hopefully the judicial branch will be able to save us. And I think also we have plenty of representatives, myself included, that we tell folks our office is a safe space. Come in, we want to get you on the record, explaining exactly how this is going to impact you. And we're a safe space. And I've had people reach out to me and says, well, my family's not as supportive, but thank you for expressing, and supporting and fighting for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Byers, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I want to go ahead and jump in. And for trans kids, if they don't have an affirming home and they can't find affirmation in schools, and they're stuck in that dark place, walking in the darkness alone without a parental hand to hold, sometimes without friends' hands to hold, and then seeing that their state is telling them that public school, which should be open and accepting for absolutely everybody around them, is also going to be forbidden for them to be able to be themselves no matter what. And then we wonder about suicide rates, why they increase, why they go up. Because that pressure, this perception that you are not wanted, no matter where you are, it has a horrible impact on people. We've got to find ways to affirm people. We've got to find ways to tell people that who you are is perfectly fine and wonderful, and we love you for who you are, no matter what. And like I said, those kids that don't have that, those are the ones that I worry about the most, because those are the ones that we see the newspaper story and the parents they just seem so happy. We don't know what happened because they're hiding. They've been hiding this whole time. I mean, this is personal for me because, as I said, I didn't begin living authentically until 2014. I was 51 years old. That is a long, lonely walk. And no kid needs to have that, not in this day and age.
Thank you so much, Representative. Representative Rafferty, did you want to speak to that as well?
Well, I wanted to say that there is another provision to the gender care affirming ban bill where that forces teachers and school administrators to out a kid if they even suspect that child is transgender to the parents. And when this came before me in committee once before, I cited the fact that when I came out initially, I didn't come out to my parents first. I came out to a very trusted teacher or another trusted adult for some guidance. And that teacher never once told me, don't tell my parents. But that teacher also said, you're going to know that your family situation best. You're going to know what you can do, what your parents, you're going to know your situation better than anybody else. And that's what's also terrifying about this, is because I know that there are trans kids out there who have a trusted adult, who then that trusted adult would have to betray that trust in order and out that child by law in order to, it's just terribly tragic because echoing those sentiments, I mean, coming out's hard. Being a teenager is already hard enough. And as I'm working and talking with trans youth here, as these bills have been moving through for the past 3 years, they're terrified. They're terrified that this is, Alabama's supposed to be their home. They live here. They grew up here. They're born here. There's no good reason why they should have a target on their back, but that is exactly how they feel. And I just, the best I can do is just look at them squarely in the eye and tell them, I have your back. I have your back. I'm going to do everything I can to fight for you because I know that they're absolutely terrified.
Kate, did you want to chime in at all, or?
I'm not sure that I have anything to add in addition to all of that. I mean, I think that's also real. And, everybody in their remarks talked about the cost to children. And I just want to emphasize the cost to children is not just when the laws pass. I mean, obviously that is a very, very heavy cost, right? The cost to children is when these bills are introduced. And Representative Rafferty, I'm thinking about Alabama. You've been successful in pushing this medical care ban now, pushing back on it. But this is the second session that these kids have had to hear, third session, that these kids have had to hear that this medical care, which they rely on, in some cases, this is life-saving care, that this medical care might go away. And that is so scary. It is so scary. And, I'm also thinking about Texas right now, where because of the governor's lawless order, right, there are now families who are truly terrified because the Department of Family Services is showing up at people's houses, people who are loving parents, people who have great, healthy, strong relationships with their kids, whose kids are thriving because they are getting best practice, medically necessary, age-appropriate care supported by the American Pediatric Association, the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, and that Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton banded together to try to take those kids out of their homes. And why? To punish the parents, to punish the kids. It is about the fear, it is about the cruelty, because no one can argue with a straight face that these kids are not being well taken care of. No one can do that. It is a political stunt. And the cost of that political stunt is true terror for the families who are living under it. And these other states, these bills, just having them be introduced, we know has a negative impact on the well-being of LGBTQ people, hearing your humanity debated over and over again by the people who are supposed to represent you. And what we know is that these people don't represent the American public, right? Polling data for support for non-discrimination has never been higher. It's like between 75 and 80%, depending on which state you're talking about. The support is hugely high. These are not things that people want. These are not real problems. These are not debates that people want. This is 100% about these politicians who are craven, who are cowardly, who would rather put the well-being of these kids at risk than miss any opportunity to try to score points with the furthest far right part of their primary voter base. And it is shameful and it is hurtful, and people are truly suffering in the meantime. And these politicians truly don't care. And I do believe we saw around HB2 in North Carolina, the folks who put that bill forward, they were certain it was a political winner. They were certain it was political gold, and they overreached and it came back to bite them. And I do believe that we are on the precipice of that happening now. People are starting to understand the true cruelty of this moment, that this is not about public policy. This is not about a real danger. This is not about anything legitimate at all. It is 100% about politics and by people who truly have no bottom.
Thank you for that. And then I think Representative Gonzalez is still on the line. I don't know if Representative Gonzalez, if you want to chime in or not, but just flagging that you're still here for folks, since I know you're not on camera. Okay, we can go to the next question from Jim McLean at Kansas News Service. Jim, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you for organizing this meeting. First of all, a couple of clarifying questions for Representative Byers. I just want to make sure that I understand, referencing your last remarks, were you referring to Senator Erickson when you talked about the actual personal relationship that you've had with her for years?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. And the other question for you is, you say that the ACLU here in Kansas is poised and ready to initiate legal action should this ban bill go all the way through the process?
My understanding is they are. We've been working hand in hand with the ACLU of Kansas as well as Equality Kansas as these things come through the State House, and building coalitions so that we can approach it however we need to. Also, constitutional law professor at Kansas State University, Kyle Velt, she's been engaged with this as well in focusing the way the rights lay out when we start looking at legal ramifications.
She testified at the hearing, did she not?
She did, yes.
Okay, and final question for you. You referenced the legal action in Idaho. Can somebody on the call give us a status report? You say that, when the litigation there finally ends and a decision is reached, if it's declared unconstitutional, of course, then that has an impact on all these other things. Where is that right now in the process?
I would yield to anybody else that may have better experience with it. My understanding is at this point in time, it has gone through a U.S. District Court, and the law has been stayed as far as implementation goes, but that they're working through an appellate process that we really expect it to show up in the Supreme Court at some point.
Okay.
Yep, I agree with that. That's exactly right. It is stayed. There was actually, for folks who are so inclined, the decision staying that law is really, really, really instructive and interesting. It's by a judge who was appointed by a Republican and really goes through very step by step what the rationales were for passing the law, to what extent those seem to be supportable and not. And as you may imagine, because his decision was to enjoin the law from being able to go into effect, he did not find the arguments in favor of the law to be persuasive. But I think it's extremely well done and worth checking out for anybody who's interested.
Do you have any concern that this should go all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court about what might happen there, given the proclivities of the court at the moment?
Well, look, I mean, these bills across the country are all being challenged. The Human Rights Campaign has some of those challenges. The ACLU has some of those challenges. Lambda Legal has some of those challenges, right? There are challenges that are happening to nearly all of the legislation that has gone into effect over the course of the last few years. And we'll see how they work out. But I will say this, if you have a very small group of people, a very small specific group of people, and you make a law that targets very, very small specific group of people, you have no evidence to show that there's an actual problem. No evidence, very small, very specific group of people targeted. And what you can show is discrimination. What you can show is animus. What you can show is that the law was passed on the basis of dislike, misunderstanding, discrimination. That is a violation of equal protection of the laws. So, you know, the Department of Education has weighed in with some thoughts on some of the litigation. And, you know, the Department of Health and Human Services weighed in about what was going on in Texas. And there are definitely implications for federal law. But, you know, I always come back to the idea of just constitutionally, it is a violation of equal protection of the laws for you to pass a law because you don't like somebody. And if you can't justify your law with facts, and if there is evidence that you don't like the people that you're trying to hurt, you have a violation of equal protection of the law.
Thank
We're
you.
also, and we're also seeing, you know, like in Idaho, where if families provide healthcare, you know, affirmative healthcare for trans youth, and to do so, they have to take the kids out of state to get so. They're saying that legally the state can pursue them out of state to do so. And so we're also looking at attacks on interstate commerce. We're looking at laws that haven't existed since the slavery laws in the 1850s that made it legal to pursue, you know, escaping slaves across state borders. We're seeing things like that come around. So there's a whole lot of legal ramifications with this. They don't have much to stand on when they bring this stuff forward.
Thank you for that. I think our next question comes from Serena Marshall with Now This. I think, did you have another?
I just wanted to follow up actually on Jim and the Supreme Court that he was asking about. I mean, we know that the Supreme Court last year declined to take up the bathroom bill, upholding the Fourth Circuit Court. I mean, it sounds like Texas is trying to get this back into the Supreme Court. The makeup of the current court, they're more inclined to take up these contentious issues and push back on some of these this exact area. So is there concern then that if it does get taken up, that it could go against you given the court makeup, or is the real desire for the Supreme Court to finally take it up and make a real ruling on it?
Well, just for clarity, right now what's happening in Texas, the case that's challenging the Texas unlawful executive action, that's filed in state court. So that is about you know, the state court, state law, not about federal law. So that's not something that is working its way through the federal court, but through the state court. You know, and I think you know, my answer to that, Serena, is the same as what I said to Jim, which is, look, you know, there's no doubt that the federal judiciary has changed tremendously over the course of the last few years. And that includes, of course, the Supreme Court. Not going to pretend that that is not the case. It is the case. And there are still basic principles of the rule of law. And I'm a lawyer. I was trained to believe rule of law matters. I was trained to believe precedent matters. And certainly, you know, there's reason to have faith in both of those things shaken more recently, but I think fundamentally, this question of equal protection of the law, to me, it's so clear. It's so clear. And so, you know, am I anxious to see whether or not the Supreme Court agrees with me? I could wait. I'm not anxious to have them weigh in on that particular question. But I do think that as these issues work their way through the federal courts, as our issues have always fared as they work their way through the federal courts, there will be wins, there will be losses, there will be setbacks, there will be challenges, there will be victories. And so I have been doing this work for too long to count out the LGBTQ community and frankly, the growing acceptance of LGBTQ people. And that does matter to the court. And I think that these are last-ditch desperate efforts and by our opposition to try to pull back on equality. And I do not believe that they will be successful, not in front of the Supreme Court or anywhere else.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. The next question comes from Samantha Rydell with them, and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Samantha, go ahead.
It's Riedel, don't worry about it. Everybody does it. Thanks everybody for being on the call today and taking the time. I just wanted to ask, a lot of the conversation today has obviously been about pushing back on bills that are already moving through legislation and everything. But we've also heard from a lot of you saying that there isn't actually that much support even from conservative legislators and their constituents. So my question is really, how do you feel, open question to anyone who'd like to chime in, how do you feel that the conversation on trans rights and trans protections can be changed so that that level of support is actually reflected and we aren't doing quite so much just like damage control as we are today, and we're thinking more proactively?
Anyone want to?
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in on that, but if anybody else does, Representative Byers, did I see you going for your mute button? Okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, look, I think this is the way the conversation needs to change. I think that over the course of the last several decades, the conversation about LGBTQ equality has just changed tremendously, right? I mean, if you fast forward, or I'm sorry, rewind to say 2020, the turn of the century, and it was like 2000, the year 2000, right? The way that we were having this conversation in the year 2000 is not the same way we're having this conversation now, right? People have a completely different entry point into the issues now than we did then. And there are a lot of things that have changed, but one of the most important things is that people know people who are LGB. For the most part, we see that things like marriage equality and support for marriage equality really track with having someone who's LGB in your life. And even if that's not somebody who's your brother, your sister, your friend, but it's somebody who goes to your church, it's somebody, one of the other parents at school, that just being able to have a little window into the humanity of another person has really allowed the support for marriage, support for same-sex relationships to change dramatically over the course of, say, I'm just picking those 20 years, but right, like that window. And we have not seen that same level of increase. There's been very marked and important increase, but not that same level of increase around trans issues. And partially that's because there just aren't as many trans people. And so people are less likely to have trans folks in their life. It's also been a lot less safe for trans people to come out. And so it is also, I think, extremely likely that more people know trans people than they think they do, because those people are not out to them because those folks don't feel safe. And so that is part of what we have to do, is a part of a chicken and an egg situation, right? Where we can't ask people to come out if they're not safe when they do come out. And people are going to be much more interested in coming out once they're safe. And people coming out is going to help us make it more safe, right? So it's a cycle, and we do have to work on that. And I think the reason our opposition has chosen trans kids to go after is because even for folks who are fair-minded and who believe in equality, generally speaking, they might not have all of the information on what it means to be a trans 8-year-old. They might not have all the information on what it means to be a trans 15-year-old. And so if the opposition comes in and starts filling people's minds with lies and misinformation and fear, people don't necessarily have enough information to say, well, that doesn't sound quite right, right? And then they start entertaining a conversation that has no business being entertained. We don't have to have a hypothetical conversation about what happens when trans girls and women participate in sports, because trans girls and women have been participating in sports for decades all around the country at every level, right? So we actually know. We know we don't have to worry that if we start allowing trans girls and women to participate in sports, that women's sports is going to fall apart. We know it won't. We don't have to talk about it in the hypothetical. We don't have to worry about it. We know for sure that it's going to be fine. And so the same thing is true when we're talking about the medical care bans, right? Where suddenly the opposition is just so concerned about what the long-term effects of puberty blockers are on trans kids only. They don't seem to be interested in the fact that these are all medications that are routinely prescribed to cisgender kids. And even in some of the places where allowing gender affirming care has been banned, they're explicitly making exceptions for cisgender kids receiving the same medication. So that's not about a concern about whether or not the medication is safe. That's discrimination is what that is, right? And so what we have to do is help people understand there's nothing scary about an 8-year-old who's transitioning. For kids who are not of age to be going through puberty, transition is social. It is using a different name. It is using a different pronoun. It is presenting yourself in a different way. It is not about medical intervention, and it is certainly not about surgery. Medical intervention begins at puberty and is usually, and in many cases, a trans young person going through puberty will be prescribed puberty blockers, and that will keep them from going through puberty and having their bodies irrevocably changed by puberty. And then once they are of an age to give informed, meaningfully informed consent, that is when they start making the changes to their body that are more permanent. And so this entire conversation has been completely fabricated by people who know that fair-minded people don't understand everything that I just said. And so they get nervous and they start wondering. And then they start asking questions. And then the next thing you know, they're having their minds filled with this poison that the opposition is putting forward, right? And so I think that's how the conversation has to change. We have to lean into this moment. We have to help people understand what's true about trans kids. We have to help people understand what's true about the transition process, about what happens to a person's body, why sports is not the scary proving ground that people seem to think it is, right? We are having conversations that simply have been manufactured. They are manufactured crises for us to be spinning in, because that's where places like ADF want this conversation to be, because they know there's misinformation and lack of information. So that's my answer to you, is that we have to get in there and really educate people about what it means to be trans, what it means to be a trans kid, and to shut down this opportunity that our opposition has created for themselves, where they lie and they get to tell the story about what it means to be a trans kid.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Kate. And I just put in the chat a link to a backgrounder on the facts of what gender affirming care actually is, so folks can take a look at that. I believe that's the end of the questions, unless there's any additional questions media has. Just quickly put it in the chat. Otherwise, I think we're a bit over time here, which has been a really great conversation. Any other last questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And I just want to say a huge thanks to our legislative leaders for not only the work that they're doing on the ground in the states, on the front lines fighting these bills, but for joining us today and sharing thoughts. And huge thanks to Kate as well for all of your insights here. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to follow up with myself or Henry. And thank you again. Have a good day.